Hello, I'm Zuleikha Chaudhari. Thank you for joining me and us for the second public rehearsal of what is currently an Untitled Trilogy. The three parts of the Untitled Trilogy comprise the restaging of a historical trial that took place in pre-independent India, an enactment of a post-independence People's Tribunal, and a theatre text that contemplates an alternate national future. These public rehearsals foreground the fragmented and untidy processes of thought and related notions of contingency, interruption, augmentation, repetition, version, and rupture that are usually obscured by the real thing of performance. They will take different forms, fluctuating between auditions, readings, conversations, reenactments, and an exhibition, which take place either online or here at Box Okhla as the physical rehearsal site. This is the second of 10 public rehearsals, which the other 8 will happen through January and February next year. Today's rehearsal, a conversation with Prakash and Shahrukh are thoughts on the body and its location in different landscapes and architectures. I'm going to begin with some ideas from an earlier project that happened between 2014 and 2018, rehearsing The Witness, the Bhaval court case. The Bhaval court case was a pre-independence court case that revolved around the identity of a sannyasi, rumored to be the heir of one of the last great zamindari estates in undivided Bengal. The Bhaval estate was the 5th largest estate in the district of Dhaka, and more crucially, one of the few properties still outside the domain of British rule at the time. Ramendra Narayan Roy was one of 3 brothers who inherited the estate from their father. In 1909, he went to Darjeeling to seek treatment for syphilis, but apparently died there at the age of 25. Soon after his death, his 2 brothers also passed away, leaving the Bhaval estate in the control of the British Imperial Court of Wards. In 1920, nearly a decade later, a man appeared in Dhaka, covered in ashes, and sat in quiet meditation along the banks of the Buriganga River. He sat on the street for 4 months, attracting attention, and rumors began to circulate that this was the second Kumar of Bhaval. There was speculation and disbelief at the resemblance of this man to Ramendra Narayan Roy. Those who saw him were convinced he was the second Kumar, even though he spoke Hindi, not Bengali, and despite the fact of his reluctance to confess to his identity as anything other than a sannyasi. Arrangements were made for him to meet the Kumar's family. The second Kumar's wife, Bibabati Devi, refused to meet this man, steadfastly maintaining her position that this was an impostor and the Kumar was dead. The Kumar's sister, Jyotirmay Devi, became convinced that this man was indeed the second Kumar. In 1921, the claimant arrived in Dhaka to meet the district magistrate and collector to record his claim. A series of witnesses was systematically put together to establish that this was, in fact, Ramendra Narayan Roy. Unwilling to accept this impostor's identity, the Court of Wards also began to gather evidence to suggest that this man was not the second Kumar. Over 16 years in court, the man's physical attributes, birthmarks, testimonies, witnesses, and his memory were put together as forensic evidence to establish the identity of the man. The case was in trial from 1930 to 1946 and was fought in the District Court in Dhaka, the High Court in Calcutta, and finally in the Privy Council in London. The trials finally ended in 1946 with a victory for the plaintiff, who died 2 days after this verdict was given. A set of photographs in the Bhaval album, which is held at the Al-Qazi Foundation for the Arts, New Delhi, are of Kumar Ramendra Narayan Roy before his alleged death in Darjeeling, as well as of the plaintiff, the sannyasi, dressed to look like the Kumar. These photographs, used in the original trial to establish likeness between the plaintiff and the Kumar, and thereby confirm identity given the plaintiff's alleged loss of memory, were the basis for the project Rehearsing the Witness, the Bhaval court case. The last of three, the third iteration of this project, took the form of a retrial of the original materials. The retrial, staged with a theatre director, myself, a real lawyer, a real judge, reenacts sections from the original testimonies as well as produces new ones. The witnesses, contemporary experts in their own field, speak from the original testimony as well as offering his or her own opinion as an expert. J.L. Winterton, artist and photographer, was a plaintiff's witness and was performed by Shahidul Alam, who is a photographer from Dhaka. J.H. Lindsay, collector of Dhaka, who was a defendant's witness, was performed by Nandini Chatterjee, who is a legal historian at Exeter University. Percy Brown, an artist, also a defendant's witness, was performed by Rahab Alana, curator at the Al-Qazi Foundation for the Arts, New Delhi. Dharam Das, one of the rescuing sadhus and subsequently guru of the plaintiff, also a defendant's witness, deposed to the plaintiff being one Sundar Das, alias Mal Singh of Ajula, Punjab, as his chela. This testimony was performed by Ahona Pal Chaudhari, anthropologist from Brown University. Bibabati Debi, widow of the second Kumar of Bhaval, defendant number 1 and eyewitness to his death, was performed by Samina Lutfa, sociologist at Dhaka University. The part of the plaintiff was performed, that is Kumar Ramendra Narayan Roy, was performed by multiple actors. Their testimony slipped between reenactment from the original testimony and auditions. In an audition, actors witness their lives, including the fact that they are actors looking for work. On the one hand, there is documentary, which is their own biography, and on the other hand, fiction, the part they are auditioning for. The scenario is quite ambiguous. Are they performing a part? Which is the part and which is the character? Believability within the context of theatre can be possibly considered credibility in the context of the law, where the production of reality relies on the plausibility of a narrative and the assumption of a stable and consistent identity of the witness. The state, that is the British Court of Wards, is one of the parties in the Bhaval case, and we see via the testimony of expert witnesses on the body as evidence, as the site where identity is played out, and photographs to establish likeness and thereby confirm identity, what the state considers and requires as identity, and where the individual locates it. The following is part of the testimony of Ramya Bodipilli, an expert witness for an iteration of the project that did not eventually take place as scheduled at Asia Topa in Melbourne in 2020 because of COVID-19. I'm just going to read a little bit from her testimony. Is it any easier to resolve such a case of contested identity today by employing the capabilities of information technology-based algorithms? For the purposes of the current iteration of Rehearsing the Witness, we are altering the context. The Sadhu Kumar is now a man who is seeking to emigrate to Australia. His background and other facts remain the same. The 12-year vacuum in his narrative still attracts suspicion, and he has no proof in the form of documents or a digital footprint to explain this gap. This could be situated in a larger context of refugees and asylum seekers fleeing conflict or calamity-ridden zones who often have such gaps in their claims. How would immigration treat such a case? The added layer of technology would be a part of the identity determining process in such a case. The algorithm could be a complex set of programs that fulfilled different capabilities: facial recognition, predictive technologies, and pattern detection. In such a scenario, the two contesting versions of identity would be that of the plaintiff and that produced by the algorithm. The algorithm is coded to detect patterns by simplifying information presented before it and prioritizing some data points over others. When a population is translated to a database, it provides a platform for an algorithm to learn to detect patterns by associating certain data points with certain metrics. In this manner, algorithms learn to match similarities and eliminate difference. Importantly, the algorithm is oblivious to context and the values and stakes that are present in any scenario. When used in an immigration context, the algorithm relies on the database of past immigration applications and who were actually granted residence in Australia. It would then judge all future applications on the basis of the patterns it detects from the database. In the case of the Sadhu Kumar, the algorithm would also have access to a wide range of databases where information of the Sadhu Kumar might be present. This could include current bank accounts, medical records, CCTV footage, social media footprints, transaction with government services, and many others. So on the one hand, the algorithm relies on the database of who was admitted to Australia, and on the other hand, it constructs an identity of the plaintiff based on his digital footprint, if there is one. If the metrics of the two match, the algorithm would recommend the Sadhu Kumar for acceptance into Australia. A new identity mediated by the algorithm thus emerges. Algorithms could have the veneer of mathematical neutrality, but they are actually inherently biased. Bias could seep in the process of developing the code itself, depending on the representativeness of the original database it is based on. In yet another possibility, the manner in which the algorithm is taught to frame a problem could itself be problematic. For instance, if the Australian immigration policy is intent upon limiting the number of people it admits, the algorithm would frame its quest as one that is seeking to exclude rather than include. The algorithm uses its language depending on how the algorithm is taught to frame its problem. The language could also be laced with an understanding of what an ideal immigrant to Australia is. The ideal immigrant could be considered to be someone who is valuable to the country's economy and would be productive in this pursuit. The immigration policy prefers people who are highly skilled, that is required to be productive in the economy. This creates different classes of immigrants, each prioritized according to their need in the country. These problems are indeed created by human authorities, but are embedded in the algorithm through the program. The code is indeed shorthand for the preferences, biases, and intent of the human actors that shape it. The algorithm further uses this language to simplify the metrics presented before it and makes a decision by valuing some metrics over others. Positive constructs of an immigrant, like highly skilled, financially solvent, and family-oriented, thus get embedded in the code, as do negative constructs such as low-skilled, poor, violent. The language of the algorithm is therefore manipulated to suit the purposes at hand, which in turn has an impact on the kind of understanding that these algorithms can mediate. The code, therefore, ends up affecting the political and the social. It acquires a performative nature where saying coincides with doing. This is the end of what I will be reading from her testimony. The imposter as an actor, or the actor is an imposter. The Bhaval material focuses on citizenship as performative. A template and a score, the successful performance of which is always the matter of an ongoing test. One achieves citizenship, one loses it. One's performance is either applauded or it fails to live up to the demands, requirements, and standards that accrue to it. Everything about the plaintiff is disavowed and therefore uncertain in the eyes of the law. His name, his history, his memory, the sense of his identity's continuity in historical time. Yet he is called upon to attest to his identity within a space defined by notions of subjecthood and citizenship as framed by the law and constitution. In what way does the radical freedom in quotes, of such a subject, existing outside all official structures of identity as recognized by the law and the state, double and resemble and become homologous to the non-existence and therefore radical freedom of the imposter and the actor who is everything but also nothing? I'm going to leave it at this question, which is what I'm going to pose to Shahrukh. But before I do that, I just want to introduce the two of them. I have been in conversation, I've been speaking to both Brahma separately for a period of time, and also Shahrukh for a period of time. Both have now told me they feel that I have been auditioning them.
Secretly.
Or not so secretly. Yeah. So I will just, and I thought as part of this rehearsal and as part of the rehearsal on this Untitled Trilogy, it would be good for me and for us to be in conversation together, but actually very specifically for them to be speaking with one another. I think the reasons for that will emerge as we go through the conversation. I'm just going to introduce them. Brahma is a writer, cultural theorist, and assistant professor of theatre and performance studies at the School of Arts and Aesthetics, JNU. He is the author of Cultural Labor, Conceptualizing the Folk Performance in India, and Body on the Barricades, Life, Art, and Resistance in Contemporary India, and we will be talking a little bit about this book today. His research interest lies in regional cultural performance traditions from North India, with a special focus on the question of aesthetics, marginality, and environmental and cultural justice. Shahrukh Alam is a constitutional lawyer, a human rights activist, and an advocate at the Supreme Court of India. Alam is also a scholar of sociology and works within the disciplinary field of law and society. Alam's litigation practice also includes Indian prisoners of conscience or political prisoners who are arrested on unconstitutional charges. She is a graduate of the National Law School of India, University in Bangalore, and holds an LLM degree from the London School of Economics and Political Science. Thank you both for being here. Can I re-ask you the question, or are you good with?
I think I'm all right.
Okay.
Although you said to me that this was going to be a conversation.
It is a
conversation. And the thing with conversations is that when you feel overwhelmed, you pour yourself a little wine and you walk away. Can't do that. But I'll pick up from the idea of the imposter or the outsider in law. And law always needs an outsider. That's how law operates, in the sense of creating a state of exception. So when you're outside of law, you become bare life. Law can then strip you. And the one stark example that I can think of is the Article 370 case that was being heard. The judgment is going to come out on Monday. And for 7 days, the petitioners argued their case against the revocation of Article 370. And then the state argued their case, such as it was. And on the third or fourth day of arguing their own case, the state suddenly remembered that the lead petitioner, Akbar Lone, who's a sitting MLA from the National Conference, is actually a separatist. So they came to court shouting and screaming and saying that the lead petitioner is a separatist. And what does the Supreme Court do? A 5-judges bench of the Supreme Court says, first submit an affidavit before us, saying that you believe that Jammu and Kashmir is an integral part of India, and then we'll hear you more. This has nothing to do with anything. Article 32, the right to access justice, is not dependent on whether you believe Jammu and Kashmir is an integral part of India or not. But this is the affidavit that the Constitutional Court demanded from Akbar Lone. FIR 59 of 2020, which was the main FIR registered after the Delhi riots / anti-CAA protests, which booked Umar Khalid and Sharjeel Imam and others. The primary charge against Umar Khalid in that FIR is that he was mobilizing Muslims. He was giving Muslims the vocabulary to articulate their grievances against the Indian state. That is not an offense. That is his democratic right. But suddenly, the law had made him an outsider imposter. Why are you mobilizing other Muslims? Why are you giving them vocabulary to articulate their rights? And third of all, the figure of the terrorist, who's completely outside of law, who's completely the outsider, the imposter to law. I was at a very interesting book talk yesterday. There's a wonderful book by Mayur Suresh called Terror Trials.
Yep.
It's an ethnography of terror trials in Tisazari court. And Mayur was making the argument that when you're outside of law, when you're the imposter to law, then of course you're in a state of exception, you're bare life. But also what colonial law did was, it brought you inside. But law, or when law was executed on bodies, it had the power to strip you again, even while you were very much inside. So law can strip you, law can make you a bare life. And then Mayur argued that normally, after independence, when we were going through the process of decolonization, law should have withdrawn a bit. Law should not have been so invasive. But instead what we see is a profusion of law and more law and more law, multiplicity of law. Law governs big things, law governs small things. So now what law does is it overwhelms. It strips you by sheer numbers. Everything that you do is governed by some law. And it's in your response, always trying to keep up with law, is when you become bare life. So now, he also describes this thing as the technology of law, the technicalities of law. You're forever engaging with the technicalities of law. And if you stop engaging with the technicalities of law, then you'll at once be made into an imposter. So then consider this, I think, illegal demand from the Constitutional Court to give an affidavit. But Akbar Lone had to give an affidavit. He had to step up and say, well, I believe that Jammu and Kashmir is an integral part of India, just in order for his case to go through in the Supreme Court. So he was forced to engage with the technicality of law, with the technology of law. Umar Khalid is having to say that, no, I was not mobilizing only Muslims. I was mobilizing all secular people. He's having to engage with the vocabulary, with that particular technicality of law. And also the figure of the terrorist. That is why we have to now start every conversation by first condemning Hamas, by saying that no, we are really not terrorists. We condemn all terrorism. But you can't really question the essence of that word at all. So all of us are forever engaging with the technicalities of law, and that also strips us, that makes us into bare life. You know, when you asked me if this looks familiar, and I said it doesn't at all, because our courts are nothing like this. Our courts are crowded, you'll not be able to access the bench at all. They're loud, they're noisy, they stink, they're filthy, and they're very crowded. And it's because all of us, citizens, are forever engaging with the technicality of law. The second point now is about What does law and politics do? And I think basically law and politics classify violence for us. They teach us that some violence is necessary, like the kind of violence that the state performs on its citizens, preventive detention or detention while you're under trials, or capital punishment, death sentence. And all of this is necessary violence. Then there's another category of lesser violence, violence that private citizens perform on each other, but it's of a lesser degree because it came out of grave provocation, for instance, or it happened because you're mentally incapacitated. So law excuses certain kinds of violence, but the worst kind of violence is that which private citizens perform on each other for no real reason, no obvious reason. So look at this example. In law, the criminal justice system has the right to detain anyone for up to 180 days, that's 6 months, only in order to coerce from them a confession. But if, as a private citizen, you illegally confine someone in order to coerce them into something, then that's considered kidnapping. That could get you a sentence of up to 10 years. It's exactly the same thing. We all believe in custodial interrogation, but we don't believe in confinement in order to coerce somebody into doing something. And why is that? Why do we tolerate the fact that the state and the citizen are not equal parties before the law at all? The state has primacy of being. We tolerate that because the presumption is that whatever the state does, it does in public interest, one. And two, because there is neutrality. The state will treat different interest groups with complete neutrality, with complete equality. And that is the only reason why we tolerate the primacy of the state. But in any constitutional democracy, law also provides for us space to constantly rebut that neutrality. The constitutional democracy has the right, people have the right to keep telling the state that, look here, you're not being neutral. You're not at all being neutral. Or to also say to the state that we need to reclassify this hierarchy of violence that you've created. We need to challenge the ascription of meanings that you are giving to everyday acts. So therefore, in a constitutional democracy, there should be space for people to come out and say that you can't keep somebody in detention for 180 days. That's not on. No matter what they've done, no matter how big the public interest, you can't do that. That's in a democracy, though. In authoritarian states, they guard meanings very jealously because everything depends on those ascription of meanings. So I'll give you a spectrum of violence these days. On one hand is terrorism, and on the other hand is national security. And both can't be touched. Equally, both cannot be touched. You can't ask the state to be more definite, more specific about what is national security. And similarly, you can't ask the state to be more definite and more specific about what it means by terrorism. Those are both black boxes. They cannot be unpacked. And when I was thinking about this, there are two sentences in Brahma's book, which is a wonderful, wonderful book. On page 46, you say, authoritarianism must... I need to take my glasses. Authoritarianism must curtail words before curtailing life and freedom. And on... a second. And on page 56, you say, birth of the monologue. Any hierarchical society is a society of monologues. The husband speaks, the wife listens, the priest speaks, and the devotees listen. The guru speaks, and the pupils listen. The leaders speak, and the followers listen. A dialogue happens among the men, among the Brahmins, within the caste, in the castle and the streets, and within the quarantine boundaries. But there remains a monologue in the real sense. And when I read this term, I thought about this idea of terrorism and the idea of national security and how it's always a monologue. And over to you now.
Thank you so much. And of course, I will come to the provocation about this imposter. But I think my mother, I come from a small, agricultural family background. My mother used to tell me that key two person you should not meet in life, lawyer and doctor. And I think I've written something that really landed me here. So I think if she is going to see this photograph, she will be really terrified that what I'm doing here. Yeah, so coming back to this question of imposter and also this question of law, the way I can see this is also becomes a very foundational idea of relationship between the art and the state. So for example, if you're thinking about this whole idea of the imposter, then imposter also becomes a figure that can also embody some idea of the art and so a state to remain as in a state have to have some kinds of regulation. A state to remain as in a state have to have some kinds of boundaries. A state to remain as in a state have to have some laws and legal provisions, and that is very foundational and fundamental to a state. But art to remain as an art have to cross that boundaries. Art to remain as an art has to transgress some kinds of limits. And therefore this the relationship that we are discussing about this imposter again becomes a figure that becomes a really a kinds of great figure if we are thinking from theater point of view or from art point of view, because this is the figure of transgression, and that transgression also it is about figure who remains outside. Brecht has, Bertolt Brecht, the German playwright, he has a very beautiful essay on female impersonator, because we are also discussing about the imposter, but also this all these nomenclatures also goes together. So either we are talking about imposter, either we are talking about impersonator. We have categories in Jharkhand and Bihar called Bahrupia. So Bahrupia becomes many times they get attacked, assaulted, precisely because of the reason that they are not people are not able to locate them. A state and law have to locate every citizen, and that becomes again an idea that how in law person has to be located, your identity has to be marked, your again village has to be marked, but again that becomes a problem for both the artist and for this imposter and impersonator. And Brecht used this term that how he's talking about impersonator, and he would say that impersonator, so he's talking about a male impersonator and female impersonator, and he's saying that how when you are female impersonator, then perhaps you are able to see the male violence, this violence, gender violence more accurately than others. So if you are becoming others, then there is a possibility that you can uncover many things, and that also suggests that when you are outside, then precisely it gives you more lens. When you are at a distance, then there is a possibility to see things more, and that is where I see that this whole idea of the imposter becomes very very interesting in this idea of the art and the state. Also related to this is that we have and I think many of you must be having this experiences. So if you go to the bank earlier and they will ask you that to match your signature, and if you are not able to match your signature, then you landing up in a kinds of again that either you have to bring some people who can provide some kinds of become witness for you, or maybe you are not, so they know that you are the right person, you can provide that you are the right person, but again this whole idea about that you are not the right person unless it has not to be corroborated with some other person, and again this becomes an idea. So I think, but again the point I want to make it here that how this figure of the imposter or figure of the impersonator becomes some kinds of ontological kinds of figures if we are thinking in terms of art and the state, because that remains the point of contradiction between art and the state, that how to maintain law and how to transgress law, because without which I don't think art and the state both can operate. So what a state is doing is a very one can say very ontological nature. What art is necessarily also doing is to its own kinds of ontology, and that is the way I would like to put it. Coming back to this question about this whole idea about how to think about this, the language, that monologue, And so whether I'm part of academia, the way we articulate language, the sorts of vocabulary that I use in my classroom and things, many times it appears like we are participating in monologue. So I'm not necessarily talking about one monologue that is necessarily coming from authoritarian state or that is coming through some kinds of hierarchy. But again, these hierarchies appears in our everyday life, that is becoming part of our culture, part of our education, where monologues are coming in different kinds of settings and different kinds of colors. And that is what I would like to say, that how to break these boundaries, how to transgress these boundaries. Otherwise, public sphere, all public sphere is all about some kinds of participation of the public who participate in some kinds of monologue, and that also becomes a problem. So either you are part of the media, part of the academia, part of the theatre also to an extent many times. That is also to what extent we are able to cross our own boundaries, and if we are not crossing, then are we able to produce some kinds of dialogue or not? And that remains still a question that we can discuss on. Mm. Yeah.
Shall I add to that? Or?
Sure. Sure.
Yeah. When you speak about art in opposition to state power, but there's also a very interesting line of argument in your book where you say that art can also be the imposter, in the sense that it finds its way. But what it does is it appropriates the essence of radical politics and then twists it. And Urmila is in the audience, and Urmila and I are both obsessive watchers of detective fiction. And there's a question that we've been thinking about, which is, why do our own gritty, realistic projects, and I'm thinking of The Family Man, for instance, why do they always reiterate power? Why is it that even when we set up morally flawed heroes, they actually just reiterate power? They have no doubts about violence. They're not cynical about national security. They're reproducing it. They're empowering it. And you've said that. You've said that in the way Kabir's words have been appropriated. But you've also talked about Phulan Devi and the representation of Phulan Devi in sensational ways versus her representation in more traditional epic narratives. Do you want to talk about that a bit? Art as imposter versus art as radical freedom.
Yeah. So what I will do before I go to Phulan Devi, and definitely I will go to discuss Phulan Devi, but before I would like to read out one page from this book where again this question of imposter, question of doubt, question of outsider, art as an outsider comes in. And then this comes with this whole idea about and you know better than me, that there was a whole allegation against Barbara Rao, a poet activist, about how he was planting some kinds of he was planning to kill Prime Minister. And so I would like to read it because I think in reading that maybe sentence, this whole things may come more forcefully. Seriously ill and octogenarian poets, cultural activists and senior intellectuals plotting to kill a Prime Minister, the plots were too good to be true. One would have loved to believe this conspiracy as a Shakespearean prophecy, but it neither has the potency of that language nor the depth of prophecy. Such allegations against poet and activists were not only bad humor, but it was also bad rhetoric. The case against Barbara Rao and others were not only a poor conspiracy plot, it was also a case of poor prophecy in the language of poetry. A poet could have prophesied, could have made a prophecy. Oh dear leader, you will also fall like all the great dictators. Or else, like three witches in Shakespeare's Macbeth, the poet could have predicted, where shall we meet again, in thunder, lightning, or in rain. That would have become more conspiratorial in that sense. Prophecy is the higher language of conspiracy. Both have two modes of temporality. Conspiracy lives in historical time, prophecy lives in a dream time, only to rise against the oracles, prediction that Oedipus will kill his father and marry his mother. The state should have charged Barbara Rao for the prophecy that the state should have charged Barbara Rao for the prophecy that he necessarily and always commits as a poet. But then it would have been difficult to charge him, as prophecy carry what Albert Camus would say, the impossibility of proof. So how are you going to charge a poet? And that is what also becomes, for a state, it becomes difficult, that how you're going to, so all the cases that you are giving, that necessarily you have to bring them under some kinds of ambient. Unless they are not coming to, under this ambient, it is quite difficult to charge these imposters. So they becoming the imposters in terms of the language. So Albert Camus would use the term impossibility of proof against the poet. In other words, the authority can charge the poet for only one reason, for the impossibility of proof, that you are not able to produce your own proof, for leaving no traces of the crime, for producing surplus meaning that cannot be captured, for telling so many stories, for asking unanswerable questions. Like children, poets have inexhaustible questions to ask or stories to tell. And Barbara Rao writes, what needs to be said always remain unsaid. How you're going to, how the law is going to capture the things that remain unsaid. And that becomes a kinds of also some kinds of consensus between art and how a state is going to behave, or how a state is going to do this trial of the art or artist for that matter, because it is not the same proof that we can talk about. And that is what, coming back to the question of Phulan Devi, when Phulan, so I don't know how many of you know, but again, Phulan became Phulan before she appeared in the public sphere. And so it was like local epic singers, they will start so they have not seen, they did not see Phulan Devi that time. So it was all like a rumor among them also that there is a person, woman, she's really leading leading the group or gang for that matter. And so they started writing epic before they saw Phulan. So in that epic, what happens in the early epics, the Phulan is really height is almost 7 feet, and she looks so tall, she is so body built and everything is that. But when Phulan suddenly appeared in the public after she got arrested, then that whole the myth that they created has come to that kinds of completely got distorted in that way. But what they have done, started doing again, because those epics already made Phulan sensational in those cultural sphere, especially in the regions of Bundelkhand, some parts of the Bundelkhand. And then you have contemporary singers who are coming from maybe many times Dalit Bahujan kinds of consciousness. They are doing something very, very interesting, and that is what we are going to also discuss about cultural justice. So in all the major narratives that either cinema has done or many popular culture, she will be projected as a bandit queen. But now they started calling Phulan Devi as a queen of justice. And that comes in song. So even if you know Indian society, and if you are knowing about village society, then if girl is born in a village, then maybe family is not also happy, your mother is not happy, your father is not happy that way. There will be sad situation. But now what is happening in case of Phulan Devi, that they are singing a new kinds of song, where they will say that how when Phulan was born, a sky came dancing, sea came dancing, everyone was dancing. And that is what I am saying, that how these singers are providing narrative justice to Phulan Devi that could not happen during her lifetime. But again, we will come to discuss more about cultural justice. But again, this was the background about Phulan Devi, and also about some kinds of proof that becomes impossible to arrest artists. But again, then you have to bring them under the ambit to make some kinds of crime.
I want to tell you why, again, your example of Phulan Devi appealed to me so much, because I've been struggling with this question of why these gritty realistic thrillers reiterate power, especially when there is a morally flawed hero who's usually an alcoholic. And it seems to me that it's because our morally flawed heroes are grounded in a behavioral disorder. They're either alcoholics, or they're just angry, or they're bad fathers or bad husbands. They never come from a position of social or political marginality. They're never cynical. They never doubt. There's absolute certainty. So these behavioral traits don't really make them outsiders. And your example of Phulan Devi's case, especially in the Bandit Queen story, where it's mostly behavioral, where it's very individual, struck me. And you said that the difference is that the epics, the local narratives, talk about structural violence. And that would happen if our gritty realist projects, or gritty realist thrillers, located heroes in those positions of if he were a Muslim spy, a Muslim law agent, or if he were a Dalit or Adivasi spy, then there would be a different kind of complicating of those stories. There would be a different kind of doubting of what national security means, or what nationalism. And there are some plays like that. Patalon did that, or The Heart did that a bit, but not really. I've been reading this wonderful commentary on Graham Greene, and they say that Graham Greene's thrillers are infused with they call whiskey fictions really. So the hero is always an alcoholic, but that's not all there is to it. He is an alcoholic, but these are really structural critiques about the cruelty of governments and the cruelties of nation states and of boys boarding schools even. But they're critiques, right? But in less skillful hands, it just becomes a whiskey fiction with nothing to back it. And again, Urmila had pointed me to this wonderful series on Amazon, I think, Foyle's War, or there's another one called Gentry. And here the detectives are really world-weary, but they're world-weary because they're doubting what is going on. In our context, the world-weariness translates into physical tiredness, which I saw in Delhi crimes. It just becomes very superficial. And that is what struck me when I read about you distinguishing the ballads from the Bollywood films.
Yeah.
So,
Sorry, I have a question. My question is, because when I read the Phulan Devi article that you wrote in this question of cultural justice, can you speak about it a little bit more? Because I thought about it a lot. And I think I discussed with you questions about cultural arguments in law. Because I was working on another project at that time, and I was trying to think about different kinds of legal arguments.
yeah.
And so the cultural argument in law was something that I thought of when I read your article. So I do want to ask you to clarify a little bit more explicitly what you mean by cultural justice, and it would be great if you could respond to it. Of course, there is the question of justice, and then there's the question of law. But I mean, one of the things I was thinking about is constitutional justice, and then law, and then cultural justice. And I don't know myself how to even put them adjacently. Maybe they don't need to be connected. But how do they speak or not speak to each other?
Yeah, so this, I did this book called Cultural Labor. So perhaps, in my life, I have 3 aims to, 3 books to finish. And that is one, cultural labor, cultural justice, and something related to culture and nature. And I think that would be life game kind of things. Okay. So coming back to this whole idea of the cultural justice, because this was I have been working on this project, on this idea for some time now. And it happened, I was in my village in Bihar, that is around 70-75 kilometers from Patna. And then I was talking to one person, his name was Gani Rai, and he passed away 3-4 years back. And then I started, we were talking, and he said that I remember Azadi. Azadi ka mujhe sab kuch yaad hai, I remember everything about Azadi. And I was quite surprised that this man never went to a school, not educated, always working field. And so what he knows about Azadi. And he said that, that time I was literally around maybe 8-9 years old, I was sleeping in my field. And suddenly there was a whole, he could hear the sound that Azadi mil gayi re. Is tarah ki awaaz aayi, Azadi mil gayi re. And we all started running towards the field. And we all, so there is 2 villages, one largely Muslim dominated, Muslim population, and other you have kind of quote unquote Hindu population, and same way. So people from both the villages are coming to running towards river Ganga, and he is saying that they all came and stand at a point, and he could see Tiranga flying on the moon. So what he's saying, like, to repeat it, so he literally saw that Tiranga was flying on the moon. And that really pissed me off. I said, okay, what is this, like, Tiranga flying on the moon? And, like, of course, you can just reject these stories as a superstitious kinds of belief and things like that. And then he is corroborating other person. He's saying that this is not only me, but there were like 4 or 5 other person they also saw. They all ran, we all were there, and it was Tiranga flying on the moon. So almost like 4 person now. Out of 4, like almost 2 died, and so you still have 2 other person who is coming and saying that yes, they saw Tiranga flying on the moon. They dekha, wo suraj dub raha tha, Tiranga was flying on the moon, and they witnessed it like standing there. And then also, so this was one story. Other story was that there is a whole stories nearby Patna and Danapur. And I think Shahrukh knows Danapur, Patna, that area, those regions, where you have whole stories around like Momin Sahib. And Momin Sahibs are like ghost figures where white becomes ghost. So you have like whole Momin Sahib. So still people get possessed by white Sahibs. So it was like almost now you have like more than 60, 70 years, and people are still getting possessed by white Sahibs. And then I was trying to understand the psychology of these kinds of figures, that what is happening here. So maybe for us colonialism, when we talk about colonialism, then colonialism just becomes some kinds of abstract experience, some kinds of theory, some kinds of idea of theorization. But for them, they like colonialism was some kinds of monster figure. And then I collected many stories. Again, you have Gerson, who also wrote several stories, where he's giving these examples that like when they hear that how these monsters are coming, then the village will fall ill. It is not they are witnessing or encountering any policeman person or something like that. They would just hear that something Britishers are coming or some monsters are coming, and the whole village will feel inflicted by colonialism. They are not getting encountering colonialism. They are getting inflicted by colonialism. And then one can ask that then the experience of colonialism was very different for them than the way we experience and the way educated see it. And you have several such stories. So we can also talk about what happened in Chora Chori. In Chora Chori, all the participants are saying that we participated in all this attack because it was like grace of Gandhiji. So then how you are going to respond to these kinds of thinking? And then I started taking these examples where I think unless we are not understanding that experiences in a more concrete sense, where it was working at a very deep psychological level, it was working as inflicting some kinds of pain that could be only cured through healing and things like that. And then I came to this idea about that how to think about, because it was like social justice, the question of social justice was not giving me response. I was not able to find out. So then I started working on this idea of the cultural justice. Now, what I do mean by when I'm talking about cultural justice, then how I'm trying to theorize it and how I'm thinking about it. First of all, I still feel, and I think I would agree with many theorists of social justice discourse, that social justice discourse have done enormous kinds of debate and opened up a lot of spaces in India and remarkable kinds of things. But still, when it comes to cultural kinds of things, then many things remain missing. And this debate also came during the Pond tribe when they protested against Vedanta. Then they were making interesting remark, and it was not that they were performing or enacting. They were saying that we have come to this world to save these hills. There is Nyamgiri hills. We have come to this world to save these Nyamgiri hills, and if we are going to cut these hills, then what is the purpose of our life? Now the question comes that how we are going to respond to these kinds of things, where almost your life, it is becoming a kinds of some kinds of anxiety, some kinds of psychological thinking, some kinds of psyche is deeply rooted in culture. And therefore So when I'm talking about cultural justice, then I'm taking a lot from Andrew Ross, who will talk about doing justice in different ways, and he will talk about doing justice to culture. Because culture becomes the sites of hierarchy, culture becomes the sites of different kinds of operation. And you have I have been body on the barricades, I have discussed about how when we are talking about some kinds of dance movement itself, then either we are talking about Natya Shastra, either we are talking about different kinds of choreography, there are already movements are already guided. It is already provided in our cultural indexes, and that becomes the sides of problem, that how we are going to do justice to culture. Unless you are not going to do justice to culture, I don't think like we are able to provide justice in that sense. And therefore justice has some kinds of healing capacity. It has some kinds of of course justice not only to be delivered, but it has to be performed, and it has to be felt, and that
seen.
becomes see,
And
seen, and that becomes the context about that why we need to reiterate this question about doing justice to culture. Same way, we can talk about second category about pursuing justice through cultural means. And if you know, I don't know how many of you know about Buddhan theatre. So Buddhan theatre is a theatre group in Gujarat, Ahmedabad, where there was a whole community Buddhan theatre is working about getting out of a stigma attached to nomadic communities, that they are criminals by birth and things like that. So this group is working around this theme, and so how they are trying to find some kinds of justice through cultural means. And you have many theatre groups for that matter, dance group for that matter, where they are trying to provide some kinds of justice through cultural means, and that becomes again another idea to think about cultural justice. Also justice, seeking justice for cultural claims, and this discourse is becoming very, very new, because indigeneity discourse in India still remains very, very new, but I think that discourse is a discourse of the future that is going to determine many of the things around cultural justice, because now, of course, they are talking about Sarna religion, they are talking about different identities, they are talking about customary laws, and many other things that is not based on the question of equality, but the question of differences, the question of autonomy. So how social justice not necessarily, when social justice brings this idea about equality, it not necessarily brings the question of autonomy. It does not discuss so much about differences, and therefore also we need the idea of the cultural justice to make some kinds of sense. Also making cultural sensitivity, for cultural context of violence. And that becomes also an interesting question for me. The way a state perpetuates violence against minority Muslims in India, the state does not perpetuate the same nature of violence against Adivasi. It is a two different nature. The way they punish, the way people get beaten, the way people get tortured, remains, it is very much based on the culture, that how you are going to damage the psychology of the person, break the confidence of that person, and I think that again becomes the kind of idea. I remember one example from Arundhati Rai, where Arundhati Rai was talking to Superintendent of Police in Chhattisgarh, Bastar, and then so this person is saying in a very interesting way that say, madam, I also have very similar ideas. I never want that government should send CRPF or army personnel here. We should just distribute television sets, and these people will become once they will have television sets, then within 10 years they will sell their own land. So please don't send I also ask the government that please don't send this CRPF or these kinds of police forces, but just distribute television sets, and this problem will be easily resolved. So when this person is talking about distributing the television sets, then I'm talking about cultural injustices that that is getting perplexed or perpetuated there, and that is the way. And also it's also when I think about cultural justice, then also it becomes some idea of recognition of differences and diversity. But saying all these things positive about cultural justice, now if you think about great mobilization, big mobilization that is happening in India, that is also happening through cultural justice. This idea
Yes.
that our past was violated, our history was not properly coded, properly recorded. Something injustice happened to us in the past. So now when I'm also talking about cultural justice, not necessarily I'm talking in only one sense. I'm also trying to theorize the cultural justice or some kinds of injustices that one feel in a very different ways for different communities. So it can be from many upper caste or that kinds of Swarna communities, but it can also come from more subaltern communities, and that is the way I'm trying to theorize. But still it remains in a process, it's a work in progress.
So,
So, art is nuanced, can be. Literature is, sociology is, law is simplistic, law is not nuanced. So, like your story, for instance, I also met somebody who was telling me about this Prachin Kalka mandir. When the mandir was very obviously not from the Prachi Kal. And I said to him, कितने साल से है? तो उसने कहा कि 300-400 साल पुराना है. And then he added, 150-200 साल से तो हम ही देख रहे हैं. But that's a similar story. Now what happens when such claims, and genuine claims, reach the Supreme Court? Do you think that the Supreme Court was trying to do cultural justice in the Babi Masjid case? When he said, no, you take it and you can have your 5 acres elsewhere. So it's a slippery slope in some ways.
I feel it is a slippery slope, which is why I had that conversation with you, because it works in it, as you said, it can work in either which way. I'm just trying to understand it in the context also of, sorry.
No, I want to ask both of you 2 questions. One is, but also before that, it also worked well in the hijab case. Because the defense and the claim in the hijab case was that this is cultural justice. The state was trying to discipline. They actually used the vocabulary of disciplining and said you can't wear it because we need to discipline you. Although the constitutional terms used in the articles of fraternity and right to choice and right to equality and right to personal autonomy, not cultural justice so much, but the idea was very much cultural justice. And it was a split verdict. One judge went with disciplining, the other judge said that you should have that choice. But I think what is important, as it is across the board, law pretends that it's neutral. Law pretends that it does not recognize power. But of course it's infused with power. But prima facie it does not deal in power. That's not the technology of law. So if all things remaining equal, it pretends that it's neutral. There's no context to it. Whereas in your writing and in our conversations, we presume power. Right? There's a historicity to everything, there's a context to everything. So when you're talking about cultural justice, there is an understanding of power. How do we translate that to law? Because
yes. How do we translate that to law?
It's there under the surface, but it's a reiteration of power. It's never a challenge. It's never a challenge to power. So, for instance, again, in a lot of my talks, this Vivek Agnihotri has become my nemesis. They keep throwing this whole post-truth condition and saying that, you speak about terrorism, you speak about bad violence, what about Kashmir files? And I never know what to say to that. So, I want to ask you, Brahma, how do you talk about propaganda? And how do you talk about good art and bad art? And perhaps if you explain to me, then I can think more about how to translate that into evidence or post-truth conditions and talk about bad evidence and good evidence. And can I... No, actually...
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, so coming to this question of evidence, because I work a lot with oral materials, oral kinds of histories, oral kinds of context, and then also in terms of poetry, what is the truth claim of poetry, or even if you're reading Bhakti Sufi kinds of things, then the whole idea is that what is the evidence, and we know that Kabir will talk about evidence, Pramana. Yeah. Pramana is that evidence. But what is Pramana? Pramana is concrete evidence he's talking about. But again, he's making some kinds of truth claim, that how Pramana becomes a truth claim with some kinds of force of imagination, with some kinds of force of the truth itself in that way. Yeah. So when I'm talking about and another example, so this is one example where perhaps this truth claim, I will not use the term evidence, I will use this idea of the truth claim comes through very different kinds of sources and very different ways in poetry, in art, in other sphere, and therefore also it becomes, I think, difficulties for law and how both can go together in that sense. Another evidence, so I was doing one field work in UP Bihar border, and then this person was making, this Dalit activist was making a lot of claim about, again, that we had this hero, Nayak, Nayika and things. And then I asked that what is your proof? Evidence, आप evidence दीजिए. हम बिना evidence के किताब नहीं लिखते. You have to provide me evidence. And he said that, he told me that कि आप 2 महीने के बाद आ जाइएगा, मैं आपको evidence दे दूँगा. And then I asked again that कि 2 महीने के बाद आप क्या ऐसा कर देंगे जो आपके पास evidence आ जाएगा. तो मैं तब तक booklet छाप के आपको दे दूँगा. I will publish this booklet and will give it to you as an evidence that how. So I think that one, that you are right, that how to create evidence through these stories, but I'm not sure that how to do, because this is different other kinds of exercise, but still remains a challenge. But how to think about some kinds of proof. Another example, sorry, I can just give you examples. Yeah. So this, I think, Professor Rustam Barucha was telling me, or maybe somebody else has informed me, that district magistrate to going to village in Gujarat and asking this lady that कि तुम्हारा अपना paper दिखाओ, तुम्हारे पास paper कहाँ है? And this lady time and again is saying, this old lady time and again is saying that किसी से पूछ लो, मैं इसी पेड़ के नीचे मेरा घर है. Now, so the problem is that, of course, she is making some kinds of evidence claim.
Yeah.
But again, in terms of paper, in terms of the evidence that can be produced in the court, we don't have evidence. This also happened in the case in Australia where you have indigenous community. The community provided music as evidence.
Yes.
That we belong to this land, we belong to this region,
Song.
and things, a song and music as an evidence. So what I'm precisely, when I'm talking about cultural justice, then I'm completely understanding this sloppy ground in which this can be justified, and now you have all chances that it can go other way around. But again, how to also make some of those claims that are coming from very different sides, more marginalized sides, and things like that. So perhaps I cannot give you that how to produce the evidence, but again, these are the challenges that we are facing, and maybe we can think together about this.
I think
Sorry, I have a question.
Yeah.
If you can also answer it as you're answering this. The Constitution itself, and the Constitution itself, does it not kind of accommodate for difference?
It most certainly does. It does. But so when Brahma was talking now, I think I realized that the problem is not so much in the inherent nature of law. The Constitution does provide for difference. The preamble does.
Yes.
But also I think what I said in the beginning, 19(1)(a) gives you the right to rebut the state's claim to neutrality. And 19(1)(a) also gives you the right to shift meanings. Right? And both decolonization and redistribution of power is about this constant pulls and pushes over meanings of quotidian words, quotidian acts, very mundane everyday acts. And evidence is one of them.
Right.
So in a democratic state where you have that space, you could ascribe new meanings. You could say that the fact that he's saying that he lives under the tree is good enough evidence.
Okay.
In an authoritarian state, you don't have that space to because they guard meanings very jealously. They will not give you the space to ascribe new meanings. And I think that is the problem, rather than it feels very closed at the moment. But I think it's because of the politics of the time, rather than the law itself. Yes.
No, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I just wanted to ask, which is a question I think I've asked you a lot, and we've also discussed it differently, is this question. I've been thinking about, given my interest in law, given my interest in artists as witnesses, their artwork as evidence, as with the actor as a witness. Actually, I think I'm trying to think through this. Whose voice is heard and recognized by the court? How does one shift meanings? And meanings have to shift in order for that to happen. But I think that in some way, the question then becomes, which I think I asked you when I met you first, was about what does this even mean to decolonize the law? And because that is where it feels that, some of what you're saying is about that itself. And we have reached a point where apparently we are decolonizing the law.
Or reconquering it.
Yeah.
Well, the vocabulary is of decolonization.
We're
And
decolonizing in the sense that we're reconquering the Indian Penal Code by calling it the Nyaya Samhita.
correct.
So it's really centralization of more and more power and less space for ascription of meanings or any kind of shift over, any kind of contest over meanings. So the new terror definition, for instance, says that if you provoke or intimidate the government, that's a terror act. How do you provoke or intimidate the government? How do you do that even? But that's now a terror act.
Yeah.
Everything is a terror act. So there's no. So again, the definition of terrorism is completely opaque. It's a black box. You don't know what's going on there, as is national security. So this is complete centralization of meanings, of power.
So either it's just the use of the word decolonization, or
Yeah.
do you feel that there is a particular way to think about decolonization? There's a particular meaning of there can be different, I think the word decolonize is used across the board, but it means different things to different people and in different contexts.
I think to our popular culture and to this government, when Chandrayaan landed, the headlines were "The moon is Indian." That was also apparently an exercise in decolonization, but it wasn't.
Yeah.
It's an exercise in conquest.
Okay, imperialist, yeah.
So I think decolonization is used in the sense of a complete break with past episteme and past history and past culture, and a reconquest. A new era, a new epoch, and just reconquest. And the law is working very much in that same frame. And so again, to add to that, the other thing I wanted to say was that in your writings, Brahma, it's very clear when you talk about cultural justice, when you talk about freedom, you're speaking from the position of the most marginalized.
Yeah.
Law is doing quite the opposite. You said that, right? Even dissent, and the punishment for dissent is graded. If you're a Muslim, then you're a dissenter, you're a terrorist. If you're an Adivasi, you're a Nakshal. So all of that. And law is now also interpreting terror acts and also seditious acts, depending on who's the one who said it. So you can be indulging in hate speech, but if you're not Muslim, if you're part of the Hindutva pantheon, then it will not be considered hate speech in present laws, because there's no danger of any disturbance to law and order. I've had this conversation actually with an SHO. There was this program going on, rampant hate speeches, and I said to the SHO, "Why are you not filing an FIR?" He said, "Madam, yahan kaun aake law and order kharab karega?" And so the reasoning is that if a dissenter makes a dissenting speech, there's more chances of vigilante groups coming and disturbing law and order, which is actually the offense.
But just to go two steps before what you said, would you consider that cultural justice?
Which one?
Yeah.
Which one?
Which one? Yeah.
No, in the sense of that in one context, something can be read as hate speech. In another context, it doesn't have to be read as hate speech. But it can be read as some way of... Can it be? I'm just asking. Can it be read as cultural justice? I'm just trying to understand, because
The hate speech actually is... It's very clear now, even in terms of legal jurisprudence, hate speech is not a speech offense.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I was saying that in terms of emerging jurisprudence, hate speech is now not considered a speech problem or a speech offense. Hate speech has nothing to do with offending anyone or hurting anybody's sentiments. That is not hate speech. Hate speech is something that pushes a group of people outside of democratic spaces. So hate speech is always a majoritarian impulse. It's always majoritarian, it always comes from a position of power. When somebody in the margins is making offensive speech, that is an offensive speech. That can hurt sentiments. But hate speech is very directly linked to participation, political space in a democracy. In India, we don't view it like that. In India, we view it as a speech problem. And it's presumed that the two communities who are hating each other are equals. So I say something to Brahma, and he's in a position to then react, thus causing a law and order problem. But if there's to be no law and order problem, then there will be it's not an offense. The problem that I'm pushing him away, pushing him out of democratic spaces, is in India is not an offense yet. In Europe, it is recognized as a constitutional problem. So I don't think that's cultural. I mean, it is cultural justice, but to the marginality.
Yeah, so if I can make some kinds of connection, then I'm also more interested in this whole idea about presence of law in everyday life. In that way, law outside of the law. That is very much part of society, very much part of your everyday lives and things. And what I will do to give this evidence that how this is perpetuating some kinds of violence and how to address those kinds of violence and things, I would like to read out one section, please. Excuse me, yeah. And section is called Hatred in the Bone. Once a Muslim friend couple invited us for dinner. Though both had turned into atheists, how can you avoid the religion that goes with the names? In popular perception, if you are Reyes, you are Muslim. If you are Prakash, you are Hindu. We carry a divisive colonialism. You are either Hindu or Muslim or Sikh or Christian. Names brings your caste religious identity together into the open. The friends offered us delicious mutton biryani. My mother loved mutton. She would chew the bone with affection as if she found divine nectar in it. But as soon as she heard of that my friends were Muslims, she started looking for excuses not to go. She joined us under my pressure. We rushed to eat and started releasing the meat. I realized that my mother was not comfortable. Holding the bone in her hand, she was pretending to eat. She felt as though she would throw up. She was almost going to cry. Disgust was in her eyes. She was getting goosebumps. She could pretend like the social elite. She could not pretend like the social elites. Her disgust was out in open. I felt embarrassed. I was fuming. What was that? You hate them because they are Muslims. It is not true, she said. There was something seated deep in her psyche. She saying, I tried hard to convince myself, but I was unable to eat. My body was not ready to take it. I was trembling, she said. One day I was thinking about the incident. My mother was honest. She had a genuine hatred. The hatred towards Muslims had entered her bones and psyche. My own case was not that different. Coming from a North Indian Hindu family, I remember quote unquote Hindu family. I remember I could not think of eating beef initially. Whenever I would eat beef, the image of my lovely cow and the image of the Muslim would come into my mind. I would have a sense of guilt. I too felt nausea. The deep-seated prejudices and socialization stand against our rational decision-making. These strong predispositions are deposited under our bones, though communities have their caste, class, and geographical locations. When it comes to hating Muslims, I can certainly say that if Hindus have a hatred in their bellies for Dalits, they have a hatred in their bones for Muslims. I am reminded of my school days in Bihar. To mark our attendance in the classroom, we would say Bharat Mata Ki Jai in place of saying present or absent. It used to somehow go like this. Roll number one, and this is the story I'm telling you from my own experiences. Roll number one, Bharat Mata Ki Jai. Roll number two, Bande Matram. In the same vein, most government schools had Hindu prayers. They were prayers to Hindu gods and goddesses, Saraswati, Ganesh, or Antaryami. But this was not a joke when you had Muslim students in class. They would be largely silent. It was working as a silent revolution for the Hindutva mobilization. I asked my Muslim friend, who was my classmate then, how he felt. And he said, we used to only take it as a tarana. He smiled, and I did too. How innocent we were, how innocently alienation had already assumed the normal course. This is the colonization I'm talking about. Like more like a colonization that has gone to perception level, and unless that has gone to more ritual level, it is very much part of the festival, it is very much part of the like perception. And you have beautiful plays called the color of justice. It is based on the real trial, and then they were all the accused were acquitted in a case in UK, and then this trial happens by theatre people do this trial where they show that how very perception level all the blacks gets marked, they get ghettoized, and how the violence happens in many acts that police or judiciary can perceive. So perhaps I still am not thinking the law and that violence that is happening in terms of how a state see it, but how it has gone much deeper into cultural level, into psychic level, and from where I'm thinking about some kinds of, not to say cultural justice every time, but again, some kinds of
But
violence that
even
is
the
happening.
idea of national security
Yeah,
and
yeah.
terrorism
Yeah.
has very much percolated, right? It's not at the state level anymore. It's
Yeah,
not
yeah.
at the level of law.
Yeah,
It forms our psyches,
Yeah.
right? You call someone a terrorist. I mean, look at how we condemn Hamas every time we begin
Yeah,
a conversation.
that's
It's
true.
that deep. But we need to end, right?
Yeah.
Well, I thought we could sort of open it.
Just one last
Sure.
thing, and then with this beautiful book and
Oh my
the
God,
writing's
purpose.
beautiful,
Yeah.
it's
Okay.
lyrical, and the first chapter itself, which is called Body on the Barricade, and I just wanted to read 4 lines, which got me thinking. It says, "We start thinking from the barricades in a situation of extreme vulnerability. It is the situation in which we enter the state of non-possibility. We can't return, we can't yield anymore. It is the limit of concession after one can't surrender. But you can't stand motionless at the barricades. It is the limit, but also the last base from from where one can resist. It is the last side from which new politics and culture may emerge. We risk spaces. You are aware that if you move a step ahead, the authority may shoot you down." And as I was reading this, I thought of 2 things. One is this incident, I think it was a protest for Omar Khalid in the press club. And they assembled in the press club after 2 other venues had refused them permission at the last moment. And a lot of the audience were young Muslim men and women, students mostly. And Professor Manu Jha was on the panel. And he said to them that you are the last wall of defense. The fact that you are here, there's police outside, you're wonderful, they're taking down your names and addresses, and you're still here. You are the last wall. And I could see the pride on their faces, on everyone's face, but also the sense of continuity that this is not a new struggle, that this is not something that we've just arrived at. There is a sense of continuity from 1857 all the way through 1947, all the way to now, that we have been at the forefront. This is also our country. Our parents, our grandparents, our ancestors have been a part of whatever it is that we've managed to build or not build. And I think about that often, and I contrast that, and you've spoken about that in your Demagogues chapter, where you talk about the kind of dehumanization, the kind of memes that you see with twisted Muslim faces, or slogans of Pankchawala, this and that. And you contrast this with being the last line of defense, and that's both tragic, but that's also something very hopeful. That was one thought, but the other is a question. I'll end with this. Again, as a lawyer, when you speak about the body of the barricade, I'm reminded of this wonderful paper by Akshay Khanna, who's also a lawyer, and he's talked about unruly politics. And he says that essentially unruly politics lives in that moment of excess, which can't be totalized and which can't be defined into a political idiom. It's just sort of a breaking through in desperation or something in hope, but it's that transient moment. And I think you're also thinking of something similar when you're talking about body of the barricade. But as a lawyer, which only speaks in terms of reason and rationale, how do the two meet? What happens to the body on the barricade in the long run? Is it totalized? Does it fall back into some kind of political idiom? Does it dissipate? And how does it help the radical freedom movement?
Can I make a small? Thank you. So I don't want to give you wrong hope or like a false hope, but I think we don't have privilege not to have hope. And that is precisely my point in this book. That what exactly you can do when you are pushed to the barricades, when you are pushed to that limits, when you cannot like excuse more like no. And we can use like Walter Benjamin would use this term like withdrawal, and withdrawal in the sense of some kinds of assertion that you cannot withdraw any longer. You cannot go further, you don't have a space to withdraw. So when I was writing this book, I was writing during the time of COVID, height of the COVID, and there was a whole despair situation there, like among youths, among intellectuals, among scholars, of course in my journey. And then then you think that what you can do. As a writer, as an author, as a poet, I think we need to constantly reinvent this hope, because ultimately they want to kill this hope. This this is not optimism that we can talk about, but again I think that is the difference. I think, but again a dialogue that we can create, that you have to work through different kinds of materials. But I think the materials of poetry, the materials of theater, and these kinds of thinking, imagination gives me this idea to constantly recreate the hope, constantly to create something. And therefore even in the kinds of pushed situation, I can see some mobilization is happening. And so when I got COVID 3 times, and then I remember that day, like when you are getting COVID and like almost you are going to die, and that was the situation during the second wave. But you still hope that you try to breathe. And I think if in that situation, if we can resist, then I think we still have a lot of space to resist, and things like that. So, but again, yeah, this has been a kind of remark that we can take or we may disagree.
Okay, I'm just going to put the lights on, but when I do, I have just a question because I thought of it, but I'll put the lights on first. If there are any comments, questions, Harish?
Well, thank you for this wonderful talk. And I haven't read your book. I'll now read. Definitely, I'll read it now. So this idea of cultural justice. Zuleikha posed a question about constitutional justice, society, law, community interaction, or whether they should be kept apart, or their discussion, their intersection has to be touched upon. One first question to you is, what makes a cultural justice to be seen as justice that it has achieved its mark as? Like now it can be called as cultural justice basically. Second, am I correct when I say that cultural justice actually exists in the domain of art and aesthetics primarily? The moment it interacts with society and law, it takes very different shapes. I'll just corroborate this with the fact. If you have read Punjab's militancy era, there is this Bhindranwala who rose up, attacked, killed by the Indian military forces. He achieved a cult status to the fact that, in fact, SGPC has unveiled his poster in the Akal Takht area, basically, the Gurudwara Golden Temple. Now, if we see how his reception has been post the entire violence and that era after 2000, especially, he has achieved that sort of a godly status, and so he had sort of that cultural justice has prevailed over his image. If whatever I gathered from the idea of cultural justice which I have seen, but the moment it comes in interaction with state. He definitely doesn't fall into somewhere in an area of an hero, basically. He is one who broke the law. So there, Shahrukh, I think the question important would become is that how do we balance these ideas when a big part of society perceives something as a hero, but who is in conflict with cultural ideas, with basically cultural foundation of justice. So that question, how it is to be balanced, and precisely what had happened in Sabrimala temple case, basically, we had seen that, and how it politically affected the left parties also. They had, they were in a fix whether to support or to refute the judgment. So this is my two-part question.
I understood Brahma to be suggesting that cultural justice is also something that is affective and that sort of percolates down into a particular community and affectively then gives them the sense that they got justice, or at least that they are trying to get justice. So it's not always an end product, it's sometimes part of the struggle. So the fact that the state has not recognized him is not very relevant. It's the affective performance by the community of what went, and it's also part of an ongoing struggle. That's how I understand.
That's why I said that it is confined in the sphere of art and aesthetics, it's relevant.
You're right that way like it becomes a domain of augmentation and art and literature, but it has an efficacy that goes beyond that. So, for example, like again to so when like you have whole injustices are happening in terms of humiliation, where like mere gestures can humiliate somebody, and I can show one finger and can like dehumanize somebody, and then I think we also need justice at the level of gestures and postures. And I think that is what precisely I'm trying to say it here. And to give you this whole idea that when you are saying that maybe it is right when I'm discussing about art and literature, but it is not working when it comes to social kinds of but I think in fight for justice, it becomes a very, very relevant kinds of field. So for example, you have this whole story of Gundadhur in Chhattisgarh, who was a freedom fighter. And then there was a whole idea that was still in police records, and this Nandini Sundar writes in her own book that how Gundadhur was becoming time and again Gundadhur appears as Basai Tutu appears in Mahasoita Devi novel. That this is a figure. So any movement will happen in that region. Suddenly this figure Gundadhur will appear as a figure who is becoming a leader, something figure who can mobilize the communities. I have done some work in Bihar. So in Bihar, when this whole this struggle of conflict that was happening between Ranveer Sinha and Maoist Commission, the MCC in 90s, then people from marginalized community, they were not giving slogan of Marx, Mao, Lenin, Jindabad and things like that. They were saying, "Good, Dina Bhadri Baba ki jai." Dina Bhadri became the figures of mobilization there, and they were really becoming a real social force. So not to say that they were just remaining in the field of culture or literature, they were really able to mobilize the communities. Same, you have many stories around this Birsa Munda, where there was a whole rumor you can say whatever, belief that the Gunda Birsa Munda cannot be killed, or we were going to fire the bullets will turn into water. So I'm talking about different kinds of perception. This is the things that is happening at the perceptual level, things that is happening at a bodily level, gestural level, and I think a lot of violences, lot of that kinds of injustices happen on that level. So how law is even going to talk about those kinds of violences, and also how this field also remain outside of that kinds of the state and law relationship, perhaps that we are talking about here.
And if I may add, it's not always to challenge power. Sometimes it's in the service of power.
Yeah, this service also.
The idea of New India, Nyam Bharat, whether we are wish gurus or not, we don't know. But it's working. It's obviously working inside on the community, on the nation.
Yeah, if it is able to mobilize the community, if it is able to mobilize that society, then how you can negate that field? You have to necessarily talk about that also.
I have a couple of questions. So there's one for Shahrukh and there's one for Prakash. So this goes back to the initial parts of this discussion around, like I felt like the underlying sort of theme that was being talked about in a sense was the question of motive, right? So the part where we're talking about the imposter and the outsider to the law. We're talking about, like I suppose what the law in asking Akbar to produce an affidavit was doing was asking him to make his motive visible to the law. Now we understand the importance of motive when it comes to the accused. However, in this particular case of a petitioner, like I guess what I would want your thoughts on is how to resist this the power of the law to make the motive of the petitioner or the accused or the defendant subject to it, right? Because then what is being judged for a moment there is not the case at hand, it's the motive. And whether there is a way to extricate motive out of the hold of the law, out of the hold of the law's power to govern, the law's power to decide whether you live or you die. So yeah, your thoughts on that. And also in the sense that sometimes motive is nascent. It is perhaps not fully formed at the time when one is produced in court. The second thing is, like, I find value in the conversation about cultural justice, a lot to think about, but I'm wondering how you differentiate that from, let's say, something in the realm of cultural revival. Revival, reanimation, necromancy, I mean, we can think about it, in a certain sense, making the dead get out of their graves and dance again. Even the enactment of what they were perhaps when they were living, a past that was once living and it's not anymore. So I think there is maybe, to me, I feel like we could do with a differentiation between cultural revival and cultural justice, and perhaps that would address the question of what happens when a dominant community or a majoritarian state sees that notion of cultural justice, and it's actually cultural revival or reconquest. So yeah, those just.
So in some cases, motive is completely irrelevant, right? It's what the court did, and if at all it was even thinking in terms of motive, would be akin to me asking you now what your motive is in asking this question. Are you trying to give the court the benefit of the doubt? But it doesn't matter what your motive is, right? And this motive is very irrelevant to the problem at hand, the issue at hand. Motive in law is relevant only when, in a criminal case, when you're trying to decide whether there's mens rea or not. If there was no mens rea, you acquit. Motive is also relevant in a public interest litigation where the petitioner is supposed to come with clean hands to the court. If he or she is personally involved, then they don't take it on. But in this writ petition, where he's saying that I am personally affected, motive is completely irrelevant. So what they were doing was not trying to understand or go into all of that. They were changing the rules of the game. They were saying that even though you have the right, a constitutional right to access justice under Article 32, we will not give it to you if you're a separatist. That is unconstitutional, right? There's no other way to look at this.
Yeah, so I would agree with you that it can go in direction of cultural revival, but at the same time, like if you go with this whole idea of producing new culture, the sense of the new culture, or even in the case of ethno break, for example, you have new Buddhism is becoming a major movement in Maharashtra, then what they are doing to symbolisms, what they are doing to some other kinds of figurations, and therefore there the sense of justice comes in, or some kinds of distribution of sensibility comes in. So how you are going to distribute that sensibilities that have been part of some kinds of hierarchies and things like that. For example, Gadar, I have done work on Gadar and Jannatamandi from Telangana. Gadar is a famous balladeer who recently passed away, and he was from Telangana. So he wrote lot of songs, many songs. So he wrote songs on garbage. Garbage, my mother, is a famous song. And he basically saying that how garbage is a very inclusive figure. There can be no other inclusive figure like a garbage, the dumb garbage, where anyone can come in. Now suddenly he is giving you a kinds of like garbage that you used to see like in different light. Suddenly he is changing the whole meaning of that garbage. Dappu was an instrument. If you're thinking about Dalit art, then Dappu was an instrument that will be like played either in very inauspicious occasion or it will be seen in a kinds of light that you should not see. You should not see Dappu or should not many times hear Dappu. Now with the Dappu getting a new kinds of meaning, it is becoming part of the democratic movement and precisely it is able to bring cultural revolution also. So you are right to talk about cultural revivalism, but again there is also possibility to talk about cultural revolution in the same sense in that way. And therefore when I am talking about cultural justice, then it's a double-edged sword that I'm entering into and trying to theorize. So yeah.
Yeah, sure.
So it's more like afterthoughts to hearing the three of you.
Yeah, she's the person who is coming from law, but she's also having degree from PhD in theatre and performance studies. Yeah, so.
And these, I'm kind of also articulating my thoughts and I'm speaking. Going back to your response to the earlier question.
I think that's how you use the mic.
Just make a minute.
I think it's on.
So, going back to this sort of the violence committed by law and the evidence of that violence which is committed by law, I would like to have your response, both of your response on both these ideas in terms of body, how body carries that violence from, and how does the culture respond to it. I'm sure both of you did talk about it, but if we can also talk about where is the space of any consideration of that evidence in law, in practice. There are no records of that violence, and I'm thinking of that violence in terms of a lot of communities, immigrants, migrant labor, more recently, children, animals. Those and that violence comes in various ways. Elimination of voices of those who are concerned. Curtailing of rights, giving rights to others and not the actual citizens whose rights are involved here. Or the way even in which law considers what a right is and what is right. So, but this violence is there. And then you only see culture as the only mode or medium which records that evidence. Yeah. And that violence continues through generations.
I think law also records that violence. If I just reference the examples that I was giving, detention without charge for the 90 days and then for up to 180 days. The law records that. I was doing a case where we were making the argument that in 100% of the cases, the NIA asks for more time. It says that we have not finished our investigation in 90 days, we need 90 more days. And the accused person is in detention without charge. In 100% of those cases, the NIA is given the extension. When we wanted to use this argument in court, we just looked at their own data. The NIA's website carries this data. We were investigating 160 cases. We asked for extension. We got extension in 160 cases. And if you look at the NCRB, National Crime Record Bureau, they tell you about the number of under trials, number of preventive detentions, the number of death sentences. So the law does keep a bureau of its own violence. Whether it's perceived as violence or not is another story. Right? But then again, this is very interesting. If you look at the NCRB reports from before to 2014, or sort of coming towards it, I'm talking 2003, 2004, the chapters are very interesting. They talk about crimes against the human body, etc. And they go into reasons, they go into motives, and they describe motives for that particular offense. And they describe causes like caste violence and communal violence, etc. And caste violence, incidentally, forms 33.7% of, of the motive behind all murders in India. Then they also talk about extremist violence, and that is about 3%. So 33.7% caste violence, similar communal violence, 3% is extremist violence. In the recent reports, terrorism has its own chapter. So earlier they were being grouped under crimes against the human body, not anymore. Now they're grouped under offences against the state. And they form a continuum from terror acts, acts of violence, to mere speech acts. And all of them are clubbed together. So the percentage of offences against the state has gone up from 3% to something like 60%. Because they also include things like damage to property, or sedition, or writing an article. So it's a huge thing now. So it's also being reorganized. The idea of violence is being reorganized in legal records. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's just a thought. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Asha. Again, I'm not sure which particular kinds of violence you are talking about, but again, taking general kinds of violence in the context, again, I would like to read one paragraph, sorry for that, but again, that is the only answer I can provide you. So it says, it goes like, curtailed movements create choreographic patterns. They enter the bones and become part of muscle memory. Sometimes keeping bodies on the barricades, sometimes hiding behind the barricade, they learn to walk. Caste society has produced perhaps the most conscious act of walking for women and outcaste. One must be aware of social status while walking. They not only define the social rules, they also govern the aesthetic rules. And we can go on, how, you perpetuate one violence, and largely it used to happen in feudal society, it still happens with like a minority community, context of minority community, and you will see that the behavior pattern changes. The walking pattern changes of the people, the way people articulate and speak, that also goes through transformation. And I think, of course, body carries a lot many things than what I am trying to say here. But yes, it changes like whole bodily patterns, that are speaking patterns and things like that. I have one story like from Kerala when communist movement was strong, but there was whole like caste was still very much there strong, like caste was still strong. And then there is whole story goes that comrade used to pronounce comrades in two different ways. There was a comrade who will say comrades, and they will comrade. So how like violence is very much entering into your bones and things like that. But I would also like to go back to your question that interestingly you were asking that is there something where culture can only become a repository of these kinds of violence, and I think so. Because when you are talking about some kinds of displacement, so you can maybe like give them some kinds of land. You can say that okay, you are getting land there, like we are going to what they say like to redistribute the land or give you that land in terms of replacement, some kinds of way. But can you replace the memory? Can you replace the kinds of ecology? Can you replace that whole interspecies connection and dialogue they had? And I think precisely like we were talking also had a plan to talk about some kinds of ecological connection. So what happened to that kinds of ecological connections? Finally, one story, I just have like so many, sorry to bother you. Yeah, but like a few years back, I think maybe 10 years back, there was a story that happened in Jharkhand-Odisha border. And so this forest department will hire a girl. She was around 12 years old. And so when these elephants will enter, these elephants will enter into village, and there was a whole like a ruckus that will happen through the village. And then forest department will hire this girl, and this girl will go and say something to elephant, and elephant will go back from the village. It looks like a very that kinds of a story. But the point is that then the reporter was asking her what exactly you are saying to the elephant, and she is saying that he हम मुंडारी में कुछ बताते हैं. Then again reporter is asking that but मुंडारी में तो बहुत लोग बोल सकते हैं, but nobody then elephants are not able to listen their kinds of language. And then because I am also speaking in there some kinds of resonance. So the girl was using Mundari, speaking in some kinds of resonance, and then one can talk about the kinds of ecology that elephants migrated from, where you have some kinds of human, animal, that kinds of interactions where both could have understand each other's language to an extent. One is not making that precise claim. But again, I think against some kinds of displacement, against some kinds of disposition, against some kinds of violence, culture can only become an indexes, and culture can only, in terms of stories, in terms of poetry can become an archives and things like that. And I think that is the way we can talk about, because not necessarily, and yeah, I'm not going against you, but again, in terms of producing some kinds of evidences, I think that becomes a great resources, and also provide some kinds of long resistance, durable resistance for the community to provide some kinds of healing and some kinds of things. Wherever like violence and genocide happens, you will suddenly find this ritual activities suddenly increased. It happened in Jaffna a few years back, where there were no so much ritual activities. Suddenly you had a lot of ritual activities. Now the question comes that why community suddenly started participating in ritual. One can say that the community just wanted to cope with the situation because they want to like face this crisis. This crisis happened, that war happened, genocide happened, and then how. So how Indian culture is becoming some kinds of resources to both like document this violence, but also provide some kinds of durability and some kinds of like some kinds of confidence for that kinds of broken communities for that matter. Yeah, sorry.
Sorry, Astha, I just wanted to say, before you say, is that actually public tribunals, people's tribunals, I think are also possibly sites for this.
Yeah, but I want to just reiterate this, that then does the law only understand violence against the human body? But there are so many other.
No, in fact, I was saying that the new organization of violence uh, gives privacy to offences against the state which are not offensive against any human body. They're offensive against property, they're speech offences. But all of that is being brought center stage also.
Yes, I'm just trying to direct you towards the violences against the community, and which is not again, not physical violence. So
153A, for instance, speech offence between two communities. And again, there is a legal record of injustices in the hate speech events that happen, which you get from the number of FIRs you have against dissenters who are speaking against whatever, but none against people who are indulging in hate speeches directed at another community, but not an offence against the human body. It's just an offence against, it's a speech offence, basically. And just to add to what you said, I think there's a beautiful example in your book. I thought that was very perceptive. You say that bodies take on certain, bodies remember injustices, and they take on certain forms. So somebody develops a limp, somebody starts to walk in a particular way, and so the record of injustices on the body is also very profound. And I always think of how Indian men drive their cars, especially in Delhi, North India. That reflects on the sense of space that their bodies have. No, really, if you take a right, you first go left and
All right, well, thank you so much for coming and attending. The next rehearsal will be in January, and you will be informed for anyone who is interested. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.